But now, in the case of the great detective, Bob Dixon investigates the enduring attraction of the Sherlock Holmes stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the first of which was written 100 years ago.
Blessed if I know why on earth you want all these clippings about this Baskerville fellow.
I've an idea, Watson, that young Sir Henry isn't destined for a very long existence in this world.
What?
My conjecture is that he'll be murdered.
Murdered?
It'll be very interesting to see if my deductions are accurate.
Holmes is the beautifully logical working out of an argument. His cold scientific reasoning, he's the tremendous excitement of the chase. He is a hero in a world which seems less and less likely to produce them.
In his day, he was a pioneer. He was ahead of his time in solving crime by scientific methods.
When Holmes says, "Quick, Watson, the game's afoot," you know, they race off to something, you're actually practically in that hansom cab with them.
Three distinguished Sherlockians advancing their own theories as to why, 100 years after the first Sherlock Holmes story was published, the great detective and his trusted companion, Dr. Watson, are enjoying more popularity than ever. In the intervening years since A Study in Scarlet first appeared in Beaton's Christmas Annual in 1887, the public appetite for the adventures of the occupants of 221B Baker Street has been insatiable. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's biographer is Owen Dudley Edwards.
Holmes represents pure science. He represents pure science in the practical field. That's to say, he's got tremendous energy. He hunts down, he checks his conclusions. He ranges very widely indeed. He's a great walker. He's a book buyer. He can travel extensively throughout the home counties. He has various adventures throughout the world. He is a very wide reader. Of course, Holmes is two different people in a sense. The first Holmes, the Holmes of A Study in Scarlet, is somebody who doesn't even know that the Earth goes round the sun. The real thing was that Conan Doyle realized that his first Holmes was a cardboard cutout. As Conan Doyle went on and Holmes grew on him as a character, he realized that Holmes actually must have a much larger range of knowledge and a much wider range of interests, and therefore he makes Holmes much more of a reader, much more ready, for example, to quote authors whose existence he doesn't know about in the very first story, A Study in Scarlet. So Holmes is the scientist whose area grows broader and broader, but he is the practical scientist, he's the hunter.
Like all other arts, the science of deduction and analysis is one which can only be acquired by long and patient study, nor is life long enough to allow any mortal to attain the highest possible perfection in it. Before turning to those moral and mental aspects of the matter which present the greatest difficulties, let the inquirer begin by mastering more elementary problems. Let him, on meeting a fellow mortal, learn at a glance to distinguish the history of the man and the trade or profession to which he belongs. Puerile as such an exercise may seem, it sharpens the faculties of observation and teaches one where to look and what to look for.
If there is a fault in Holmes, the most obvious one is inhumanity. He's so much the scientific reasoner that he is blind to consideration of humanity. Again and again, he risks and sometimes loses the life of a client in his enthusiasm for working out his theory. Now, of course, what Arthur Conan Doyle is doing there is founding Holmes upon doctors who did this kind of thing. The case was a success, although the patient died.
Well, whether Conan Doyle the doctor would accept that view of the medical profession, one can only ponder. But his daughter, by a second marriage, Heir Commandant Dame Jean Conan Doyle, now in her 75th year, does acknowledge that there was a little of her father in both Holmes and Watson.
My father wrote about this himself. He said that a man cannot spin a character out of his own inner consciousness and make it really lifelike unless he has some possibility of that character within him. And in the case of Holmes, of course, my father had a great sense of justice and also was very protective towards women in trouble. And so that, of course, is a reflection of my father's character. And as far as Watson goes, my father had loyalty and courage, which Watson had in abundance. And so there was a little bit of each character in my father's own makeup.
The universal appeal of the Baker Street detective is confirmed by the existence of societies of Sherlockians in 25 countries around the world. The Sherlock Holmes Society of London had to close its membership when it reached 1,000. The secretary, Bill Mitchell, believes that people continue to be attracted to the stories by a combination of nostalgia and literary excellence.
I suppose the enduring quality of the stories themselves is that they're well written, there is nostalgia, and the actual stories themselves, quite apart from all that, are very good, exciting stories. I mean, as whodunits, they'll stand up against anybody. And whereas you and I don't mind very much whether Miss Marple had orange pekoe or Lipton's Best for her afternoon tea, there are many hundreds of Sherlockians who would be prepared to tell you exactly what Mrs. Hudson prepared for old Holmes's breakfast.
Holmes is always looked on with a great deal of affection, but was there a dark side to his character?
Oh, I think he must have been a most dreadful fellow to live with, don't you? I mean, you imagine sharing a room with a chap who did chemical experiments in the corner, sat up all night smoking ship's tobacco, and when he was feeling a bit out of sorts, played the violin, which he laid across his knee, with little melodies of his own composition, which he made up as he went along. That must have been very tedious.
When I find a man who keeps his cigars in a coal scuttle, his tobacco in the toe end of a Persian slipper, and his unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife into the very centre of his wooden mantelpiece, then I begin to give myself virtuous airs. I have always held, too, that pistol practice should distinctly be an open-air pastime. And when Holmes, in one of his queer humours, would sit in an armchair with his hair trigger and 100 Boxer cartridges, and proceed to adorn the opposite wall with a patriotic VR done in bullet pox, I felt strongly that neither the atmosphere nor the appearance of our room was improved by it.
Well, the long-suffering Watson was prepared to put up with Holmes' somewhat bohemian lifestyle for 40 years, during which Arthur Conan Doyle penned 4 novels and 56 short stories about the hawk-nosed sleuth whose deerstalker, magnifying glass, and cherrywood pipe were to become unique symbols of his creation. But it's also a tribute to Conan Doyle's powers of narrative that the reader is transported back in time to Victorian London with its yellow fog swirling round the gas lamps of Baker Street. Inside the warmth of their first-floor consulting rooms, Holmes and Watson ponder some problem of the day. The pipe rack and the violin are within easy reach. The smell of chemicals from some incomplete experiment pervades the atmosphere, and all around there's a sense of untidy comfort. It was the atmosphere of the stories which first attracted the founder of the Sherlock Holmes reference collection, Stanly Mackenzie.
It is said that, of course, that he epitomizes the Victorian period. And this, if you start thinking back, is the most fascinating period that you encounter. The clip-clop of the horses, the steam trains are always fascinating to people. And as a boy, it was the fact that he was a kind of superhuman, mentally superhuman man. And a conjurer, perhaps, who would do his trick and startle you and then explain how it was done afterwards. There was this terrific fascination for me. He is an eccentric, and an eccentric is always a fascinating character, of course.
It was Arthur Conan Doyle's days as a medical student in his home city of Edinburgh which were to provide the foundation for his detective writings. But despite the fame which Sherlock Holmes was to bring, the only visual acknowledgement of Conan Doyle's Edinburgh connections are a small plaque near his birthplace on the edge of the new town, and the more obvious evidence of his presence on the outside of a public house which bears his name. In 1928, 2 years before his death, Conan Doyle recalled the inspiration for the first Sherlock Holmes story.
I was, when I wrote it, a young doctor, and had been educated in a very severe and critical medical school of thought, especially coming under the influence of Dr. Bell of Edinburgh, who had most remarkable powers of observation. Reading some detective stories, I was struck by the fact that their results were obtained in nearly every case by chance. I thought I would try my hand at writing a story where the hero would treat crime as Dr. Bell treated disease, and where science would take the place of chance. The result was Sherlock Holmes.
We've got to begin by thinking of the moment of writing. Arthur Conan Doyle is about 27. He's in Portsmouth, and he's desperately trying to make a convincing detective. And he thinks of his old tutor, Dr. Joseph Bell of the Royal Infirmary. And he remembers how Bell could look at a patient and deduce straight away from the mud on the patient's instep that he had walked across Bruntsfield links. And so he'd say to the patient, did you have an agreeable walk across the links? And the patient, of course, would be very startled, and Conan Doyle would be very startled, and Bell would get a certain amount of pleasure in showing that he had looked at the instep and deduced what the situation was. Now, in part, of course, this is a doctor's method of really being a witch doctor, impressing the patient. The doctor must look carefully at the patient to discover the things about the patient that are wrong, which the patient won't admit to, or maybe the patient doesn't realize. Bell, therefore, is important not because he was a detective, but because he was a doctor. And Conan Doyle, as a medical student, sees the way in which doctors deduce as really being at the heart of the detective story.
The basis of Sherlock Holmes' detective skills were observation and deduction, but he was also a chemist, an expert in blood. He was interested in biology and anatomy and geology, all sciences which today's forensic experts must master. Professor Alan Watson is the head of the Department of Forensic Medicine and Science at Glasgow University.
There are quite a number of police forces, and in particular detective schools, who use the Holmes books as part of their list of reading material, simply because of this idea of observation. We have a story, but forget the actual details of the story. Look through the story and see how Sherlock Holmes was acting as a detective. What did he do? He saw simple things, he inferred from those simple things and came to conclusions. And I think this is it. If you tell the reader, in this case a class of detectives, I want you to read those stories, and we'll discuss them when you've read them, and let's see, could you have done that? Could we have done that as a team? This is where they're being used as an adjunct to other standard works of reference. We're using the same sort of techniques today. I will look at some dust and think about it and say to some other colleagues, well, perhaps we ought to analyze this. Here we have some blood. I wonder if this blood has come from the victim, or has this come from the assailant? And so we're using the same techniques. Holmes took blood and had it analyzed. He certainly took small pieces of material, chemical material, and we would certainly analyze that. He would have seen some of this material, and he would have tested it as far as he could using his old-fashioned Bunsen burner and chemicals. And that's what we're also doing today.
As the Holmes stories began to receive public acclaim, so too the author's family had to learn to live with a fictional character who many readers had come to think of as a real person. Dame Jean Conan Doyle recalls her childhood days and the influence of events at 221B Baker Street.
I heard Holmes being discussed from the very earliest age, And I knew that my father wrote the stories. There was no nonsense about Holmes being a living character. But like many children, I was forbidden to read Sherlock Holmes stories at a very young age. My mother thought that I was too young, that they would be too exciting for me. And so I borrowed one of the books from the library and read the stories under the bedclothes at night. By torchlight, I suppose I was about 8 or 9 at that time.
Did your father read the stories to you once he felt that you had reached such an age that you would not be frightened by them?
Oh, yes, later on, because, of course, the casebook of Sherlock Holmes stories were written when I was a schoolgirl. And he used to read those stories to us during the writing of them. He used to think up the plots during the night. And he'd wake up and get up very early and work on the plot. He would write all the morning and then read us a half-written story at lunchtime, and then read us the completed story at night.
What is your personal favourite?
Well, I don't think I have a personal favourite really, because my father's other stories appeal to me rather more than the Sherlock Holmes stories. But I do like the Sherlock Holmes stories very much, and I always had a special thrill from reading The Speckled Band, because I saw that as a play on the West End when I was a little girl, about 8, I suppose. My father took us all to see it, and it was so exciting that I loved reading it later on.
In the next room, where the beam of a dark lantern fell on the open safe, sat Dr. Grimesby Roylott. He sat very quietly in a grey dressing gown and red Turkish slippers. Across his lap lay the dog lash with a looped end. His chin was cocked upwards and his eyes were fixed in a rigid stare on a corner of the ceiling. Round his forehead he had a peculiar yellow band with brownish speckles which seemed to be bound tightly round his head.
The band. Speckled band.
That band moved. I swear I saw it move.
Oh, yes. See the little diamond-shaped head coil up out of Dr. Roylott's hair?
What is it?
A swamp adder. Deadliest snake in India.
Has he been
bitten? Yes. Stay where you are. He's past medical aid.
What are you going to do?
The dog lash with the loop, Watson. That's how he carried it to and from the safe. That's how I shall carry it back to the safe.
Oh, for God's sake, take care. If that snake strikes again...
I shall take care, Watson.
To many, he seems to be a real person. And I have had numerous letters from time to time addressed to him from all parts of the world, and the most quaint requests, including what was virtually an offer of marriage. His autograph, also, is much in demand.
I do remember Sheriff Bag arriving at our house at Crowborough one day, full of people who had come to see Sherlock Holmes, and they had to be told that there was no such character, and that my father was the creator of Holmes.
Can you remember what your father's reaction was when that charabanc turned up at the front door and all these people got out wanting to meet the great detective?
Oh, sheer amusement.
Here in Baker Street today, there is still considerable public demand for information about Holmes and Watson. Each year, hundreds of enthusiasts arrive to visit the terraced house where they occupied the rooms rented to them by the redoubtable Mrs. Hudson. Instead, they find a modern office block, which is the headquarters of a building society, where Sue Brown has been appointed by the company as the secretary to Sherlock Holmes, answering as she does the 5,000 or so letters which find their way to the offices each year.
Occasionally I get letters from children where they've perhaps lost a pet, or their favourite bicycle has been stolen, something like that. But there again, I get letters from adults. Some of them ask quite specific questions about the cases and the books. They're the sort of more scientific ones. But other people write about various problems they've had. They may write about current day events. I've certainly had a lot of letters about the Irangate affair. A lot of letters about drugs, because Holmes actually did use narcotics. And others, simply write because they say their aunt has disappeared or their mother has been murdered and they want Sherlock Holmes to help. some people take it very seriously indeed, but they are a small minority. I mean, there are some who you get a feeling about the letters, and some are writing and you think, well, yes, I think this person really does think that Sherlock Holmes is alive and well and able to help them. But I would say that 95% of the letters are really just written as a bit of fun.
Others who take a more academic interest find their way to the Victorian home of Stanley Mackenzie in a quiet tree-lined backwater of West London. It's here that the Sherlock Holmes reference collection, gathered over some 40 years, offers the Sherlockian a rare opportunity to indulge their interest.
I bought my first edition, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, in 1946. I have all the first editions and a considerable number of Strand magazines. I have a lot of film stills, a considerable number of theatre programmes and posters. I have specialised in the theatre side. Incidentally, there is one programme that collectors go for, and that is the one that has Charlie Chaplin's name on it. Because he played Billy the Page in the Sherlock Holmes play in 1905.
What would you say is your most prized piece?
It has to be, I suppose, Beaton's Christmas Annual for 1887, which contains the first appearance of the first Sherlock Holmes story. This is the cornerstone for all Sherlockian collectors. I paid £10 for it.
And what would that be worth now, that volume?
One has to think in terms of £10,000 or more.
Keen Sherlockians can be found all over the world. In Japan, for example, interest is growing rapidly. There, the Sherlock Holmes books are used to teach English because of the quality of the writing. In this country, the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, with members throughout the British Isles, was formed almost 40 years ago. The secretary, Bill Mitchell.
There are several aims. One is, of course, to develop an interest in Holmes and to discover some of the missing links, because Conan Doyle, of course, wrote most of the stories in quite a hurry, and the fact is that he didn't really much mind whether old Sherlock went to Dartmoor from Waterloo Station or Paddington. But Sherlockians, of course, are very keen to discover all this.
Earlier this year, 70 members of the Society, each in the guise of a character from one of the stories, visited Switzerland. They were retracing the journey to the Reichenbach Falls made by Holmes and Watson in the story The Final Problem. It was here that Sherlock Holmes and his arch-enemy, the evil Professor Moriarty, had their famous struggle to the death. Among those Sherlockian pilgrims was Dennis Collins, a lawyer from Dundee with a lifelong interest in the great detective.
I represented one of the few Scotsmen in the stories, and strangely enough, as a character known as Black Peter, and he was captain of a whaler from Dundee. He was a murderer, he was a wife-beater, he was a downright rogue, a very unpleasant person. At Reichenbach, we went up, halfway up the falls by funicular railway, and there is a platform built there now which can accommodate probably about 80 or 100 people, and one looks across the falls, and there on the opposite side is the ledge where the struggle between Holmes and Moriarty took place. It is now marked with a star, and when we were there was a reenactment of the actual struggle. And at the end of the struggle, we then saw two bodies falling down into the abyss.
An examination by experts leaves little doubt that a personal contest between the two men ended, as it could hardly fail to end in such a situation, in their reeling over, locked in each other's arms. Any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless. And there, deep down in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their generation.
Conan Doyle had killed off Holmes because he'd become tired of writing the stories. He wanted to concentrate on his other literary ambitions, like historical novels. He was totally unprepared, however, for the sense of outrage and concern on the part of the British public at the death of their hero. Dame Jean recalls what persuaded her father to breathe new life into the corpse of Sherlock Holmes.
there was such a public acclaim, and the Strand magazine were always asking him to do this. But I think perhaps more than anything else, his mother felt that he should write more Holmes stories. She loved the Holmes stories and thought that they were a credit to him. And then he thought up a way of getting around this by writing to the Strand and saying, all right, he would write some more, but that only at such and such a price. And he named what he considered to be a very high price in the hopes that the Strand magazine would reject it and say it was too expensive. But surprise, surprise, they accepted.
And so many more stories were to flow from the pen of Arthur Conan Doyle, although the author himself recalls the remarks of a critic of the day who wrote of the reincarnated Holmes. He may not have been killed when he fell over the cliff, but he was never quite the same man afterwards. That may well be so, but it's often argued that of all the fictional detectives who have appeared, and in many cases disappeared, in the footsteps of Holmes, none have been his equal. It's their writers who are to blame, suggests Conan Doyle's biographer, Owen Dudley Edwards.
The reason why Holmes and Watson succeed, above all else, is that Conan Doyle never forgets he's telling a story. Detective story writers get all knotted up in the fact they're having a puzzle, they're fighting with the reader, they're fooling the reader. Conan Doyle doesn't care whether the reader guesses or not. He wants to tell his story, and he wants to tell it in strong terms of science versus humanity, the excitement of the deduction, but the underlying necessity of asserting the humane interest. And in one story, he actually brought Sherlock Holmes onto the full Jesus Christ level, giving up his life for mankind against the principle of evil. That's what happens in the story when Holmes takes on Moriarty on the Reichenbach Falls and apparently sacrifices his life.
Whether Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson can survive the rigors of the next 100 years remains to be seen. Perhaps the future of 221B Baker Street and its distinguished occupants lies with those children who read the stories by torchlight under the bedclothes, as Dame Jean Conan Doyle did more than 70 years ago.
I expect that after this centenary is over, there will gradually be a lessening of interest, but that it'll crop up again. These things do come in cycles, and I only hope that the cycles come round again in 200 years' time. There is a certain magic about the stories.
You cannot think of English literature without Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. He will live because he's immortal. When you know Holmes, when you know Watson, you're at the same time meeting Plato, meeting Walter Scott, meeting Cervantes, meeting Edgar Allan Poe, meeting Robert Louis Stevenson. It's a very, very good education.
Conan Doyle, what he had put on his epitaph is appointed to the future. I have wrought my simple plan. If I give 1 hour of joy to the boy who's half a man, or the man who's half a boy.
The Case of the Great Detective was written and presented by Bob Dixon.